What do you hold on to when your country is being erased? When hunger is used as a weapon, language is silenced, and survival becomes a quiet form of resistance? In this episode, we travel through the eyes of those who endured the unimaginable, from the hidden famine of the 1930s to the shattered streets of Mariupol. Three books, two moments in history, one unbroken spirit. This is Gateway Books by Crestance, Episode 7. Welcome to Gateway Books by Crestance, where we explore historical fiction and the real history that inspired it. I'm your host, Cindy Cruz, and in this episode, we're turning our attention to Ukraine. We begin with The Memory Keeper of Kiev, a novel that brings the Holodomor, Stalin's man-made famine, into focus through the eyes of those who lived it. Then we move to The Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, a meticulously researched account that unearths the brutal strategies behind that atrocity. And finally, we arrive in the present with War in Ukraine, Survival Diaries from Occupied Mariupol, a powerful collection of first-hand testimonies that bear witness to another generation caught in conflict. This episode is about more than geopolitics or historical timelines. It's about people, ordinary individuals trying to preserve their dignity, their memory, and their identity under conditions meant to strip them of all three. The opening pages of The Memory Keeper of Kiev are deceptively quiet. There's a stillness to them, the kind that lingers when something is about to break. Written by Erin Lidekin and inspired by her family's Ukrainian heritage, the novel doesn't begin with a sweeping declaration or dramatic warnings. It starts in a small home, with a family trying to make it through another day, unaware that survival is about to become their full-time job. We meet Katya, a young woman in Soviet Ukraine during the early 1930s, right as Stalin's policies of collectivization begin tightening around everyday life. It doesn't happen all at once. First, the grain is taken, then the livestock, then the freedom to speak, even in whispers. People start vanishing, and there's an edge to everything, like the air itself is holding its breath. And then suddenly, the famine is everywhere. This was the Holodomor, a man-made famine that claimed the lives of millions. Lidekin doesn't approach it like a historian. She doesn't need to. Through Katya's eyes, we are placed directly in the gut-wrenching day-to-day of those who lived it. In the scraped bowls, the quiet goodbyes, the aching hunger that never really goes away. There are no infographics or bold headlines here. Just a girl watching the world around her disappear one piece at a time. Katya isn't portrayed as a revolutionary. She doesn't lead marches or make speeches. Her courage lives in the quiet, in saving seeds, in protecting a diary, in remembering who she is when everything around her says to forget. And that is the point. The story isn't asking us to admire her from a distance. It's asking us to sit beside her, to understand when systems are built to break people down. Sometimes staying whole is the most radical act of all. The novel is split between two timelines. We follow Katya in the 1930s, but we also follow her granddaughter, decades later, living in Illinois. After a tragic accident, the granddaughter begins uncovering the truth her grandmother never spoke aloud. What she finds isn't just a record of suffering, it's a blueprint for survival. The trauma Katya endured didn't vanish. It lived on, in silence, in gaps in the family history, in a language that skipped a generation. That dual structure makes the story feel immediate. The past doesn't stay in the past. It reaches forward through recipes that go unmade, songs that are never sung, and questions that no one dares ask until it's too late. What Katya lived through doesn't just belong in history books. It belongs to her family, to her granddaughter, and in a way to all of us. Lidekin's writing doesn't try to impress with flourishes or drama. It's quiet and controlled, the kind of writing that sneaks up on you. That restraint is what makes the weight of the story land so deeply. You feel the loss before anyone says anything out loud. You sense the hunger in the silence between meals. The heartbreak isn't delivered in a single moment, but layered, slowly, until you realize it's everywhere. What's striking about this story is how much it asks the reader to pay attention to the small things. Across the bread becomes a lifeline, a glance between siblings, a lullaby hummed to no one. These are the things that carry people through. There are no miracles here, no grand rescues, just people holding on to each other and to whatever pieces of their humanity they can still claim. And when we return to the present day storyline, that thread connecting past and present feels tight. The granddaughter isn't just recovering her family's past, she's walking into a part of herself she didn't know was missing. Her grandmother's silence wasn't just secrecy, it was protection. And now breaking that silence becomes an act of healing. In today's world where Ukraine is again at the center of conflict, this novel feels like more than historical fiction. It's a reminder that these stories don't stay in the past. They live in families, in traditions, in scars we inherit without knowing their source. The Memory Keeper of Kiev brings us into one family's experience of the Holodomor, its silences, its scars, and the fragile thread of memory that survive. But fiction can only carry us so far. To fully grasp the scale and intent behind this historical trauma, we turn to the historical record itself. Anne Applebaum's Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, provides that lens. Pulling back from one household to examine the systematic policies that brought a nation to its knees. Where Lidokin gives us the emotional truth, Applebaum gives us the factual reckoning. Together, they illuminate not only what happened, but why remembering it matters. In Red Famine, Stalin's War in Ukraine, historian Anne Applebaum takes readers deep into one of the most devastating and politically complex famines of the 20th century, the Holodomor. Through meticulous archival research, survival testimony, and a piercing analysis of Soviet policy, Applebaum dismantles any lingering notions that the famine of 1932 and 1933 was simply a tragic consequence of bad weather or poor planning. It was, she argues, a deliberate act of political violence, an attempt to break the spirit of people and bring them to heel. To understand how the famine unfolded, Applebaum starts by laying out the broader context of collectivization. Stalin's campaign to seize privately held farmland across the Soviet Union and place it under state control. It's important to remember that Ukraine was not the only region subjected to these brutal policies. Peasants in Kazakhstan, Russia, and other parts of the USSR also suffer mightily. But Ukraine's unique geography and agricultural output made it especially vulnerable. Known as the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine had long been central to the empire's grain supply. Its black soil was among the most fertile on the continent, and its farmers were productive, independent, and deeply rooted in their land. For Stalin, that combination, productivity, independence, and national identity, was a threat. Ukrainian peasants resisted collectivization from the outset. They slaughtered livestock rather than surrender it to collective farms. They hid grain, slowed production, and clung to their cultural traditions, language, and religious practices. Moscow responded with force. Armed brigades moved in to confiscate not just the grain, but anything edible: beets, potatoes, even family gardens. Entire villages were blacklisted, meaning they were denied access to trade, food, or aid. International passports were introduced to prevent people from fleeing. Borders between Ukraine and other Soviet republics were sealed. Applebaum makes a chilling case. This was not famine as a byproduct of policy. It was famine as policy. And the numbers bear that out. At the height of the Holodomor, thousands of Ukrainians were dying each day. Families starved beside full granaries. Children collapsed in school. Neighbors turned on one another, not out of malice, but out of sheer desperation. And still, Soviet officials continued to extract grain for export, determined to meet quotas and prove the success of the 5-year plan. What sets Red Famine apart is not just Applebaum's clarity in outlining what happened, but her careful documentation of how the Soviet regime erased the truth. Journalists like Walter Duranty of the New York Times downplayed or denied the famine, assuring Western audiences that all was well. Foreign diplomats were kept from rural areas. Ukrainian intellectual and cultural leaders who spoke out were arrested. exiled, or executed. Even within Ukraine, those who survived were forced into silence. For decades, the Holodomor was suppressed memory, known intimately in private circles but absent from official narratives. Applebaum's book is a response to that silence. It restores not only the historical record, but the moral weight of what occurred. By calling it a genocide, and she does, she aligns the Holodomor with other acts of mass violence intended to destroy a people, not just physically, but culturally and politically. She also pays close attention to the human cost. Those statistics are necessary to grasp the scale. Estimates range between 3.5 to 5 million deaths. It's the individual voices that stay with you. A mother boiling leather for soup, a child wandering alone after burying his family, villagers keeping diaries in secret, knowing that if they were discovered, they would disappear too. This level of detail, drawn from survival accounts and unearthed archives, gives Red Famine an emotional resonance that lingers well beyond the page. It reminds us that famine is not faceless. It is a method of control with consequences that ripple through generations. Applebaum also explores how the famine shaped Ukrainians' national identity. In trying to erase the idea of a distinct Ukrainian people, Stalin inadvertently reinforced it. The trauma, the silence, the memory of suffering all became part of the Ukrainian story. And in the years following independence, the process of remembering, through monuments, school curricula, and public discourse, became an act of political defiance and cultural healing. Even today, the legacy of the Holodomor shapes Ukrainians' relationship with Russia. The attempts to suppress Ukrainian language, culture, and autonomy didn't end with Stalin. They have reemerged in different forms through disinformation campaigns, historical revisionism, and military aggression. In this context, Red Famine doesn't feel like a distant historical study. It feels current, urgent, and essential. What Applebaum does so effectively is bring the reader into a conversation about the meaning of history itself. What happens when suffering is denied? When stories are buried? When entire populations are told their truth doesn't count? In her hands, history becomes not just a record of the past, but a battleground for dignity and recognition. She doesn't claim that every Soviet official intended to kill Ukrainians, but the picture she paints is more complex. A combination of ideological extremism, paranoia, dehumanization, and systemic cruelty. But the outcome remains the same: millions dead, a culture nearly erased, and a truth that had to be fought for long after the violence ended. As readers, we're not asked to simply bear witness. We're asked to see the patterns, to understand how starvation can be wielded like a weapon, how bureaucracy can cloak brutality, and how memory, once recovered, can resist erasure. Red Famine is a difficult read, but a necessary one. It doesn't offer comfort, it offers clarity. And in a time when authoritarianism is again on the rise and truth itself feels precarious, Applebaum's work serves both as a warning and as a call to remember. More than anything, it asks us to center on the human story, the people who buried loved ones without ceremony, the families who hid scraps of food in walls or beneath floorboards, the ones who lived and the ones who didn't. Their lives were not side effects of policy, they were the target. And so we remember them, not only through numbers, but through names, testimonies, and the act of reading their history aloud. The echoes of that history did not stop in the 20th century. The Holodomor was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a longer pattern of erasure and resistance that continues into our own time. As we shift to the present, we witness how the mechanisms of control have evolved, but the stakes remain the same. War in Ukraine, Survival Diaries from Occupied Mariupol brings us face to face with contemporary voices, individuals once again trapped in the grip of invasion, occupation, and silence. Their stories are not a repetition of the past, they are its continuation. In War in Ukraine, Survival Diaries from Occupied Mariupol, we step into the present with an unsettling sense of deja vu. Published in the midst of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the book compiles first-hand accounts from citizens of Mariupol, a vibrant city on the Sea of Azov that found itself at the center of one of the most brutal and symbolic battles of the 2022 war. The diaries, letters, and voice recordings collected in this volume are raw, immediate, and profoundly human. There's no sweeping historical distance here, no chance to polish memory into narrative. What we read are fragments of life as it's being lived, under siege. The fear, the confusion, the hunger, the rage, and the desperate will to survive. From the earliest pages, it becomes clear that Mariupol was not simply caught in the crossfire, it was targeted. As a strategic port and a symbol of Ukrainian resistance in the eastern Donbass region, Mariupol represented both logistical value and psychological warfare. Its destruction was as much about dominance as it was about geography. And for those inside, survival became a matter of hours, then days, then weeks. The book doesn't attempt to tell one single story. Instead, it presents many. Teachers who shelter students in freezing basements, doctors who perform surgeries with no power or supplies, mothers who ration melted snow to keep children alive. Each voice is distinct, each one carrying the weight of unspeakable decisions, whether to flee or stay, whether to share food or save it, whether to record what's happening or stay silent to avoid retribution. The tone is not polished, and it shouldn't be. These are not professional journalists or historians. These are ordinary people who began writing because it was the only thing they could do. Some accounts are just a few lines long. Others ramble with exhaustion or circle back on themselves in disbelief. Together they form a tapestry of defiance, not necessarily of arms or slogans, but of memory, of saying, we were here, this happened, and this is what it felt like. What's striking and heartbreaking is how often these voices express disbelief. That in 2022, in a European country, homes could be shelled into a rubble with families still inside. That neighbors could be buried in gardens because there were no safe cemeteries. That hunger could once again become a weapon, and that the international response, though swift in condemnation, could feel so slow in practical terms. For many, the sense of abandonment hangs heavy. Yet, even with the trauma, moments of tenderness break through. A child's laughter in a dark shelter, a neighbor sharing a final can of beans, a message scrawled in chalk, still alive, left on a cracked apartment wall. These are not just footnotes, they are what keep people going. What this collection makes undeniably clear is that war is not abstract. It is not fought only on maps or in news segments. It is felt in the body, in cold hands, empty stomachs, and the sounds of missiles overhead, and the silence that follows. And for those in Mariupol, the silence became defining. Cut off from the outside world, residents had to create their own records of reality, often not knowing if anyone would ever read them. Some did not survive to see their words published. Their voices preserved in notebooks or voice memos are acts of resistance in themselves. Like the diaries kept during the Holodomor, these modern testimonies assert a truth that may otherwise be denied or twisted beyond recognition. Reading them side by side with the history explored in Red Famine reveals painful continuities. Then, as now, Ukrainian identity, language, culture, autonomy was seen as a threat by a neighboring power. Then, as now, control over information was part of the battle. Then, as now, ordinary people bore the consequences of imperial ambition. But what also emerges is continuity of courage. There's a particular strength in these diaries that lies not in certainty, but in vulnerability. These are not written by people who know how the story ends. There is anger, fear, desperation, and still a choice to speak. That choice matters because once stories like these exist, they can't be undone. They become evidence, witness, memory. In one entry, a woman writes of lighting a candle in the basement to honor her mother who died during the siege. She describes how the candle trembled with each explosion, how she kept shielding it with her hand so it wouldn't go out. It's hard not to see the candle as a metaphor for every voice in this book. Fragile, flickering, but alive. The editors of this volume make no attempt to shape the entries into a single narrative. Instead, they let the chorus speak for itself. The effect is sobering and at times overwhelming, but it is also profoundly respectful. There's no imposition of meaning, no effort to resolve or explain the suffering. There is simply space, space for truth, however messy, unfinished, or hard to bear. And that's what gives this book its strength. It doesn't seek to simplify, it asks us to sit with complexity, to bear witness not to a single story of heroism or loss, but to hundreds of overlapping truths, some contradictory, some unresolved, all real. In doing so, it continues the work of history, not the kind written by victors, but the kind kept alive in scraps of paper, in broken phones, and whispered recollections, the kind that says, we mattered, we resisted, we survived, or we tried to. In Remembering Mariupol, we're not just acknowledging what happened, we are refusing to let it disappear. Just as the Holodomor was denied for decades, so too might the atrocities in Mariupol be minimized or forgotten if not for records like these. But they exist, they speak, and they demand we listen. What these three books offer through fiction, history, and testimony is not just a portrait of Ukraine's suffering, but of its resistance. From the hidden gardens of the Holodomor to the makeshift shelters of Mariupol, the thread that ties them together is not just loss, but endurance. These are not stories about the past alone. They are about the ongoing struggle to preserve truth, dignity, and identity in the face of forces determined to erase them. In a world increasingly saturated with disinformation and distractions, stories like these ask us to slow down and bear witness. They challenge us to recognize the stakes of forgetting and the courage it takes to remember. Whether told through a fictional family's buried pain, a historian's unflinching documentation, or the urgent voices of those under siege, each narrative demands that we not look away. History doesn't just live in monuments or textbooks, it lives in the words people risked everything to write. And it survives when we read those words carefully, respectfully, and with the understanding that memory is not just what we inherit, is what we choose to carry forward. Thank you for spending time with these stories, stories that ask for our attention, our empathy, and our resolve. If you'd like to explore more episodes that connect literature to lived history, visit crestance.com, where you'll find past discussions, upcoming titles, and a curated collection of gear and home decor for book lovers. Subscribe to the channel, share the episode with a fellow reader, and let us know what books are helping you think more deeply about the world. Until next time, keep reading with care and keep history close.